إذن نبث الآن بصورة حية على صفحتنا في فيسبوك. هي الخامسة في توقيت بيروت. نبدأ الآن. قبل أن نستهل هذه الحلقة أشير قبل أي نقطة أخرى إلى أنها تعقد باللغتين العربية والإنجليزية مع ترجمة فورية إلى اللغات الإنجليزية والعربية والفرنسية للمسجلين عبر منصة زوم. سأقول هذه المعلومة بالإنجليزية والفرنسية أيضا لمتابعينا غير الناطقين بالعربية قبل أن أعود إلى مساري بالعربية. So this webinar will be held in English and Arabic with simultaneous translation into Arabic, English and French for those registered over Zoom. Je vais le mentionner en français aussi. Ce webinaire se déroulera en anglais et en arabe avec traduction simultanée en arabe, anglais et français disponible sur Zoom. أعود إلى اللغة العربية. مساء الخير مجددا. أنا الياس قطار، مسؤول النشر والتحرير في المجلس العربي للعلوم الاجتماعية. أهلا بكم وبكن في حلقة النقاش الخامسة في سلسلة حلقات نقاش الذكرى العاشرة لتأسيس المجلس العربي للعلوم الاجتماعية. وصلنا إلى منتصف طريق سلسلة الحلقات العشر مع هذه الحلقة الخامسة. أرحب بداية بضيوفنا المتحدثين والمتحدثات وبجميع من انضم إلينا عبر منصة زوم وعبر صفحة المجلس في فيسبوك، حيث تبث هذه الحلقة بصورة حية الآن. تكتسي هذه الحلقة صيغة مختلفة سيشرحها ميسر في الحلقة بعد قليل، ولكن ما أؤكده أنها حلقة تفاعلية وديناميكية بامتياز، لذا ندعوكم بل نشجعكم على طرح أسئلتكم بأي لغة من اللغات الثلاث، العربية أو الإنجليزية أو الفرنسية، من خلال خانة سؤال وجواب Q&A Question et Réponse عبر زوم، وخانة التعليق Comment أو Commentaire عبر فيسبوك. إشارة أخيرة إلى أن هذه الحلقة ينظمها المجلس العربي للعلوم الاجتماعية بالتعاون مع مجلس تنمية بحوث العلوم الاجتماعية في أفريقيا كودسريا وشراكة انتر آسيا. الآن أنقل الكلمة إلى ميسر هذه الحلقة الزميل عمر ضاحي، وهو أستاذ مشارك في كلية هامشير في الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية وعضو منسق لمجموعة عمل الدراسات النقدية للأمن في المنطقة العربية التابعة للمجلس العربي للعلوم الاجتماعية. إضافة إلى تيسير الحلقة سيتولى عمر شرح صيغتها وتأطير موضوعها. عمر، الكلمة لك، تفضل.
مرحبا، شكرا كثير الياس، ومرحبا جميعا ومساء الخير. أرحب بكم جميعا في حلقة النقاش الخامسة ضمن سلسلة حلقات نقاش الذكرى العاشرة لتأسيس المجلس العربي للعلوم الاجتماعية، وعنوانها البحث التشاركي، تجاوز الحدود ومد الجسور. اسمحوا لي قبل أن أبدأ جلسة النقاش مع ضيوفنا الكرام، ضيوفنا اللي منهم الدكتورة منى حرب، الدكتور جودوين مورونغا، والدكتور إنسينغ هو. قبل أن أبدأ بالأسئلة إلى ضيوفنا بمقدمة لتأطير النقاش وشرح خلفيته وبعض الإشكالات التي يحاول معالجتها، وبعدها سأدعو زملائي إلى الجواب على جولتين من الأسئلة، ومن ثم نفتح النقاش والأسئلة للحضور. موضوع هذه الجلسة يتعلق بتحديات البحث التشاركي أو الإنتاج المعرفي التشاركي، إن كان بين الأفراد أو بين المؤسسات من جهة أخرى، إذ إن لكلا الحالتين فوائد وتحديات. فالبحث أو الإنتاج المعرفي التشاركي غالبا ما يكون من القيم المحبذة لفظيا من قبل الجميع، ولكن نادرا ما يتم التفكير بتحدياته على المستوى الشخصي أو المؤسساتي وعلى مصادر تلك التحديات المتعددة، وهذا موضوع جلسة النقاش اليوم. أود قبل أن أبدأ بتأطير النقاش طبعا أن أشكر زملائي في المجلس العربي للعلوم الاجتماعية ولكودسريا ولإنتر آسيا ولجميع الحضور ولطبعا المتحدثين الكرام. سأركز في مداخلتي بشكل أساسي على تحديات الإنتاج المعرفي التشاركي في دول الجنوب بشكل عام وفي الدول العربية بشكل خاص، وطبعا توجد أيضا تحديات عابرة للمناطق وللجغرافيا تتعلق بعوائق مؤسساتية وعوائق متعلقة في المنهجيات أو الاختصاصات أو الفروع الأكاديمية وحتى عوائق لغوية. من الأسئلة التي يمكن أن نبدأ بها عندما نفكر في الإنتاج المعرفي التشاركي في دول الجنوب أصلا هي البحث أو الإنتاج المعرفي من أجل ماذا ولأي هدف؟ من يحدد السؤال البحثي أصلا؟ من يحدد الأولويات أو المناهج؟ من يقوم بالبحث ومن ينتفع منه. فطبعا كلنا نعلم أن أحد النماذج السائدة، وبدون تعميم مطلق، إنما أحد النماذج التقليدية في دول الجنوب هو البحث التشاركي بين أفراد أو حتى مؤسسات من دول الشمال مع نظيراتها في دول الجنوب. وغالبا ما يكون التمويل أو الأجندة البحثية وحتى منهجيات البحث محددة من قبل الشريك في دول الشمال، ودور الشريك المحلي إما هو كمنفذ أو منبع للأفكار أو حقل تجارب لنظريات مستلهمة من المنهجيات الغربية، وفي خدمة الأكاديمية أو السياسات الرسمية أو الأولويات أو الهواجس الغربية، أو حتى السير المهنية للباحث الغربي. لنعرف تلك الإشكالية بعنوان عريض هو الاقتصاد السياسي للإنتاج المعرفي. وتتفاقم هذه الإشكالية في ظل التدهور الاقتصادي والسياسات النيوليبرالية وتقليص أو انعدام أصلا الدعم الحكومي للإنتاج المعرفي والدعم العام للإنتاج المعرفي، وترهل مؤسسات الإنتاج المعرفي التقليدية، وبالطبع مع الحروب والدمار والعقوبات والاقتصاد والاحتلالات العسكرية تتفاقم. وليس هذا طبعا هو الأثر السلبي الوحيد أو حتى الأهم لتلك الوقائع، إنما تساهم في وضع إطار عريض للإنتاج المعرفي. إنما في منحى آخر فإن المشاكل تتعدى الإرث النيوكولونيالي أو عدم التوازن القوى العالمي إلى تحديات أخرى مرتبطة بالاختصاص أو بالمؤسسة البحثية أو بالأفراد أنفسهم. فعنونت حلقة النقاش هذه بتجاوز الحواجز، والكلمة التي اختيرت بالإنجليزية هي transgress، والتي باعتقادي لها صيغة خرق أو تحدي أو انتهاك أيضا، وليس فقط تجاوز، لأن غالبا ما تكون للأفراد أو المؤسسات ضوابط لا تشجع على خرق الحواجز أو تحديها. كمثال على ما تقدم، سأتكلم الآن إلى تجربتي الشخصية المتواضعة كأحد المؤسسين والمنسقين لمجموعة عمل بحثية ضمن المجلس العربي اسمها مجموعة بيروت للدراسات النقدية للأمن، التي تم إطلاقها كمجموعة عمل في ربيع 2016، وتعتمد مقاربة نقدية لانتشار برامج ومنشورات وممارسات الأمنية أو الممارسات أو الدراسات الاستراتيجية في المنطقة العربية، حيث يقوم معظمها بالتركيز على الاهتمامات الأمنية للدول، إن كانت دول إقليمية أو دول خارج الإقليم، عوضاً عن أمن الأفراد أو المجموعات أو المجتمعات في المنطقة. وتسعى المجموعة إلى الاشتباك مع الأطر المعتمدة في مجال الدراسات النقدية والعمل على تطوير مقاربات بديلة مبنية على الواقع في المنطقة، وذلك بغية فهم تجليات الهواجس والديناميات والأماكن المرتبطة بالأمن. وتهدف مجموعة العمل إلى بناء شبكات إقليمية عابرة للأقطار تكون المدينة الشرق أوسطية بيروت صلة الوصل بينها. ما يجمع بين أعضاء مجموعة العمل تجارب معاشة مرتبطة بالأمن، أو بالأصح انعدام الأمن والهشاشة والديناميات المعقدة للسياسات المثيرة للجدل وسط بيئات سياسية متعددة. هذا وقد توسعت المجموعة لتتضمن باحثين وباحثات من المنطقة أو معنيون بها يشاركون أفراد المجموعة الأساسية اهتمامهم بتطوير مقاربة نقدية للدراسات الأمنية. تطبيقا لذلك قمنا بإنشاء معهد صيفي كأحد نشاطات مجموعة العمل، ويسعى المعهد الصيفي إلى جمع بين طلاب الدكتوراه والباحثين الشباب وغيرهم من الباحثين الذين تندرج أبحاثهم ضمن المقاربات النقدية للمسائل المتعلقة بالأمن، مع أساتذة جامعيين متخصصون يشكلون هيئة التدريس. وسأعود للحديث عن المعهد الصيفي لاحقا. مجموعتنا كمثيلاتها من مجموعة العمل في المجلس العربي التي تضم مجموعة العمل حول الإثنوغرافيا والمعرفة ومجموعة العمل حول الممارسات النقدية أو الإقليميات الجديدة، تهدف إلى جمع باحثين من كافة بلدان المنطقة وخارجها بغض النظر على مستوى تقدمهم المهني للتعاون ضمن هذه المجموعات. وطبعا يسمح لهم هذا العمل ليس فقط تشكيل شبكات فاعلة ومشاركة معارفهم ومهاراتهم، بل أيضا يعزز تطوير المقاربات الجديدة التي تحاول اختراق الحواجز بين الدول وبين الاختصاصات وحتى بين المؤسسات في المنطقة. لكن لاحظنا في مجموعة الدراسات الأمنية غالبا ما نرى تغير عند طلاب المعهد الصيفي مثلا من باحثين وباحثات بين اهتماماتهم الشخصية الفعل التي هي نقدية فعلا، وما بين كتاباتهم التي غالبا ما تلتزم بقوالب اختصاصية جامدة أو بنظريات متداولة، لأن ذلك من متطلبات المهنة مثلا في حقل العلوم السياسية. فإذا أراد الباحث أو الباحثة الاستمرار في العمل في مؤسسته أو جامعته أو الحصول على ترقية مثلا، فعليه أن يكتب بطريقة معينة وبمجلات محكمة معينة تفرض على الباحث منهجية ومفردات وطرق تعبير سائدة. بينما البحث النقدي العابر للاختصاصات أو النابع من فضول شخصي أو اهتمام أو التزام سياسي شخصي قد يعاقب بطرق مباشرة أو غير مباشرة. إن تغيير هذا النموذج السائد كان أحد أهداف مجموعة العمل، أي إيجاد مساحة أو هامش من الحرية لمجموعة العمل إن كانوا من باحثين أو قائمين على المجموعة لوضع الأسئلة والأجندة المناسبة، بحيث تكون الأولويات والنظريات والأفكار توضع من المنطقة من قبلنا ولا تأتي من الخارج ولا تفرض من الخارج. وقد كان اهتمامنا في معالجة تلك المعضلة أحد الأسباب الرئيسية لإطلاق نشاط هذه المجموعة، ولذلك فإننا نحاول أن نشجع المشاركين وأنفسنا على متابعة البحث النابع من فضولنا الشخصي ومن اهتماماتنا وليس فقط من الأطر السائدة. بالإضافة إلى ذلك قررنا أن نؤلف ضمن مجموعة العمل ورقة بحثية جماعية تؤسس لفكر مجموعة العمل وتشرح أفكارنا وتطلعاتنا حول مساءلة سيرورات الأمننة في المنطقة العربية، وقمنا بنشرها بمجلة أكاديمية محكمة كنموذج للعمل الجماعي. ولكن حتى معهدنا الصيفي ومساهماتنا لا تخلو من تجلي واضح لتعقيدات الإنتاج المعرفي أو البحث التشاركي. من أبسط هذه التعقيدات عدم توفر الأدبيات الكافية باللغة العربية، وهناك حواجز أخرى. مثلا بالرغم أن معهدنا الصيفي يضم غالبا حوالي 15 طالبا من المنطقة العربية، ولكن أحيانا يضم بعض الطلاب من خارج المنطقة من الطلاب الأجانب، إلا أن الحواجز غالبا ما تكون ليس في يعني التواجد الجغرافي للطالب، إنما قد توجد حواجز أصلا بين الخلفية العلمية. ما نرى حواجز بين الطلاب الحاصلين على شهاداتهم من جامعات أوروبية يتحدثون بصيغة مشتركة، وغالبا ما تكون سيروراتهم أو طموحهم المهني وواقعهم المهني مختلف تماما عن زملائهم خريجي الجامعات الوطنية. حتى ضمن مجموعتنا أو مجموعات العمل الأخرى هنالك حواجز عملية ما بين المتفرغين للعمل الأكاديمي والحاصلين على دوام كامل في الجامعات، وما بين الباحثين والباحثات اللواتي يتواجدن خارج الحقل الأكاديمي جزئيا أو كليا. الآن أود إشراك زملائي في حلقة اليوم، وكما ذكرت سيكون هنالك جولتان من الأسئلة. سأطرح السؤال الأول وأدعو زملائي إلى الجواب عليه، ومن ثم أطرح السؤال الثاني. سيكون لزملائي في الجواب الأول 10 دقائق للإجابة، والسؤال الثاني 5 دقائق، وذلك لنتيح أكبر قدر من المجال للمشاركة في أسئلتكم واهتماماتكم. فالسؤال الأول سأطرحه على الدكتورة منى حرب، أستاذة السياسة والدراسات الحضرية في الجامعة الأمريكية في بيروت. والسؤال هو: ماذا يعني لك البحث التشاركي؟ وما أهم فوائده؟ وما هي أهم الحواجز والتحديات التي يجب تجاوزها في البحث التشاركي أو الإنتاج المعرفي التشاركي؟
مرحبا جميعا. رح سلم بالعربي بس رح انتقل واتحدث بالإنجليزي. شكرا كتير على استضافتكم ولعمر لتقديمه للموضوع. عنا كتير اشياء نحكي عنها وبتطلع بشغف على الحديث اللي رح يجي من أفكار اللي رح نطرحها. Good evening everyone. I'm going to try to reflect on Amar's questions by sharing with you some of my own experiences in research collaboration, and you know how I lived and practiced being part of research groups and research collaboration possibilities and opportunities. So for me, when I think about what is research collaboration, I very much see it in relation to being part of what we refer to with my colleagues at the Beirut Urban Lab as an ecosystem of researchers, thinkers, practitioners, I mean, people who are interested in questions that come to our minds and that we are keen on working on, and that are very much driven by a set of values and I would say a mission that drives the research. So in my case and in the case of the colleagues I work with at the Urban Lab, these are values that relate to advancing social justice in cities, speaking truth to power in contexts of oppression, of inequality, and of conflict and violence, and also very importantly, producing and making accessible evidence-based and informed knowledge that is produced through mixed methods of data collection and varied methods of data collection. Reflecting on the question, I was taken back to perhaps the very first experience I was exposed to in terms of research collaboration when I was still a master's student pursuing my studies in urbanism in Beirut at the Institute of Urbanism at Alba, as someone who was still thinking about herself as an architect at the time. And where we were taught the Institute of Urbanism at Alba at the time was very much an experiment put forth by French practitioners and scholars establishing for the first time a graduate program in urbanism in Beirut. And I was a student in that first cohort, and we were very much associated to these French scholars and professors, some of whom were working at what is today the IFPO, the Institut Français du Proche-Orient of Beirut, which was named at the time the CERMAC, one of the French research centers in the Arab world that exists in many other former colonies of the French former empire. So, you know, it echoes what was Omar saying also about colonial knowledge production. I'm also very much a product of this colonial, I would say, education, being a student of a French school and having pursued study at AUB, which is also a missionary, I mean, a university established by missionaries. So as a student of the Institute of Urbanism at the time, we were very much invited to go to CERMAC, which provided a platform that brought together established scholars from local universities in Beirut, so the University Saint Joseph, the Alba, the Lebanese University as well, in addition to MA and PhD students from Lebanese and French universities. And there was also an observatory at the CERMAC at the time, the Urban Observatory, that was observing one of the first post-war reconstruction of Beirut, namely the Solidaire project, among other initiatives that sought to rebuild the city after the Civil War. And so as part of this observatory, the director of the observatory at the time, Jean-Luc Arnaud, who was instrumental in introducing me, I would say, to this world of research collaborations, used to organize seminars during which he would invite scholars to present theoretical and methodological talks. And we would be there as students, and occasionally we could present our own work and receive critical feedback on it. There were a number of activities and initiatives that, you know, nurtured a collaborative research environment, workshops, conferences, sometimes part of, you know, a research project that led to edited volumes, so writing initiatives as well. There was also a newsletter that was co-produced by many researchers, junior and senior. There was a real effort in mentoring young researchers, introducing them to methods of research, archival research, mapping, opportunities really for young researchers to work together, to network with established scholars. And I would say that this is really my first introduction to that research collaborative environment. It's actually there that I met Satan El-Shami, the director of ACSS today. She was the first who invited me to present my work in a conference and to contribute a chapter in an edited volume. So you could see that what these research collaborative environments could lead young people to. You know, you could be exposed to a lot of opportunities and networks that would open up possibilities in your career, but it's also an environment where you grow intellectually. You're introduced to different disciplines and ontologies, epistemologies, and methods. You debate, you disagree, you challenge each other, you argue with each other, you make friendships and enemies, you learn what it means that somebody plagiarizes your work, steals your idea, pretends it's his or hers. So it's a learning environment that has a lot of challenges and opportunities, and that in many ways shapes you as a researcher. This was also an environment where we spoke in three languages: Arabic, English, and French. Actually, less in English, much more in Arabic and French. So it was rich at that level as well. It helped a lot, I would say, rigorous modalities of knowledge production. I was in many ways quite privileged to have experienced that, because the CERMOC endured for a relatively short period of time. It was a time where the French government had money to sponsor research abroad, and money dwindled with time. And by the time I left, the observatory shrank. Opportunities to sponsor all these activities I mentioned disappeared. And today, the IFPO operates much less as it used to be I'm referring more to the 90s decade, the end of the 20th century as such. So I would say that in today's academic world, in Lebanon, at least in Beirut, but I suspect elsewhere in the Arab world as well, and probably other southern countries, these opportunities for research collaboration are not many. When I moved to work in a research center and then to the university, I was not really provided with such collaborative learning environments. There was nothing remotely alike that environment I just shared with you. I was very much drawn when I became an assistant professor at the EUB to serve the university, to teach, and to do research on my own as an individual. But I believe, also because I'm trained in a discipline. I did political science after having studied architecture and urbanism and urban geography. So I'm very keen on these collaborations. I need them for my intellectual growth, for nurturing my interest. I need to talk with people. And I started looking for opportunities to work with individuals who were intersecting with my research interest. And I managed to work with a number of colleagues co-authoring articles. I worked with a political scientist. I worked with a graphic designer. I worked with a colleague in urban planning. I also worked with anthropologist Lara Dib, with whom we ended up co-authoring a book. And I was also afterwards invited to be part of these large research consortia that are funded by big research grants, and I also got the opportunity of working more comparatively on research projects. And then also being in a region where we are exposed to a continuous series of crises and wars and conflict events, we also respond to them from our position, I would say, as professionals and as reflective professionals. So we also formed groups to respond and reflect on the 2006 war in Lebanon, on the municipal campaign of of 2016, and that also produced research collaborations with colleagues. I would say all these efforts and that urge to work collaboratively led us ultimately to institutionalize our effort into the Beirut Urban Lab at the American University of Beirut, where we managed to fundraise and establish it in 2018. And now I feel it's our turn to co-produce an ecosystem that brings together urban scholars, practitioners, activists, where research collaborations can happen in order to advance an urban praxis that is driven by these values of urban livability, environmental and social justice that we care for. And so within that context, all our research projects are collaborative and engage researchers, activists, early career ones and established ones. We try to bridge disciplines and methodologies, and we're helped by that because urban studies is a very interdisciplinary field. And we work with landscape ecologists, engineers, entrepreneurs, designers, artists, planners, health professionals, and try to produce that informed knowledge I highlighted earlier. Now, to reflect on the divides that exist and the challenges, I'll just mention a few quickly before giving the floor to my colleagues. So language limitation is certainly one. We operate predominantly in English. You see that I'm unable to really make that presentation other than in English, namely because we operate in a university to which we're accountable in terms of promotion, tenure, as Omar mentioned earlier, to produce our work in English. We are making steady efforts to produce our work in Arabic. We actually just launched our website in Arabic. And, but this, of course, raises a lot of constraints and limitations to our ability to collaborate with non-English speaking scholars and practitioners. Outreach dissemination is, I would say, a joint limitation. We are operating from a private university. This is the place where we were able to institutionalize ourselves into a lab and to work and to grow as, as academics and scholars. We're very much sealed behind the walls, actual walls. We're secured by guards. We're physically disconnected from the city and its neighborhoods. So there's an important divide here related to class, to social capital, to networks. And, it determines who is part of the ecosystem we're trying to co-produce and who's excluded from it, and who we can reach out to and who we cannot, and who can reach out to us and who cannot. Another challenge I would say would be the disciplinary silo. So true, we manage to work with people from outside our disciplines, but still we're not very successful in bridging with people in social science and in the humanities because we're a professional discipline at the end, and people are not always very comfortable working with applied researchers and researchers who are interested in interventions and experimentations. A third challenge is geographical focus. We're very much, centered on Beirut and on Lebanon, and our abilities to do comparative research and regional research is quite constrained by funding and by human resources. So this is something we're very conscious of, and that we're keen on trying to transgress, if I want to use that verb. And I would finally mention the constraints and challenges of ethics and power hierarchies. Maybe we'll come back to it at a later stage. The fact that possibilities to work comparatively and regionally is often at the level of institutions, and this involved power hierarchies where we're often assigned the roles of being native researchers, native field workers. We get the data, somebody else analyzes it. This is increasingly the case with funding schemes that come from UK and European universities funded by these big consortia, where partners come from the global south and are supposed to play lesser roles. It depends in these cases enormously on who's leading these projects, their own ethics and their politics, and how they work with you or not to bridge these constraints. I had a positive experience in an EU-funded project I was part of, but I had also negative experience with the other project that I ended up just exiting from because of these power hierarchies and these, I would say, politics of research. I think I'll stop with that and give the floor to my colleagues and come back to reflections in the Q&A. Thank you very much.
شكرا جزيلا دكتورة منى على المساهمة المهمة فعلا اللي طرحتي فيها تجربتك بإنشاء مختبر المدن في بيروت، والويب سايت الموقع اللي ذكرتيه beiruturbanlab.com إذا أراد الحضور الاطلاع عليه، وهو يعني بالإنجليزية والعربية موجود أيضا، والتجربة التي كانت مبنية على تجربتك السابقة في سيرموك. فشكرا كثير على المداخلة. والآن سأدعو زميلي الدكتور غودوين مورونغا الأمين التنفيذي لمجلس تنمية بحوث العلوم الاجتماعية في أفريقيا، ما تعرف بكودازريا، إلى الجواب على نفس السؤال. تفضل دكتور.
Thank you very much, Chair, for the opportunity, and congratulations, of course, to the Arab Council for the Social Sciences on this 10th anniversary. The Arab Council and Codesria do in fact share quite a number of interesting similarities. And if you will, as a big sister organization, it's always extremely celebratory when we get to a moment like this where we are celebrating the 10th anniversary. I think the question around research collaboration makes a particular valid assumption, and the assumption being that research as an undertaking emanates from very specific locations, and that those locations, in fact, do, at the end of the day, have specific norms that guide how people do things, have specific cultures that people have developed that guide forms of inquiry that people have, the levels of curiosity, that people have, and the kinds of questions that people have, the ethics, of course, that goes with how people raise puzzling questions, what kinds of questions get asked within the public domain, and what questions are raised in different ways. So the idea of research collaboration presupposes or makes the assumption that there are different traditions of research, there are different traditions of inquiry, and that at the end of the day, no society, no location, no particular terrain exists in splendid isolation, if you will, from another, that there are movements of ideas, goods, people across different boundaries. And for that reason, therefore, the possibilities generated by the very nature of the seamless interactions between different territories, different domains, different peoples, if you will, is the basis around which the possibility of collaboration among researchers is important. And therefore, in my view, that assumption is perhaps for me the most central that we need to keep as we have a discussion around what research collaboration is. Of course, in this sense, therefore, collaboration really just means pulling together different skills, pulling together resources, pulling together intellectual labor, if you will, given the very different levels at which different societies are endowed with this. And because of that, all this is geared towards, if you will, answering prevailing questions, responding to different puzzles in life, trying to figure out, of course, why things happen in one way in particular places as opposed to the other. And research collaboration, therefore, is designed, if you will, to be able to answer bigger questions beyond the domains within which these puzzles, these inquiries have been generated. The idea of pulling together, I think, is integral, if you will, to the very nature of research work. Research work is an enormous undertaking. Even at the individual level, at the institutional level, it is always an enormous undertaking. It's an undertaking that obviously will open up more questions as you answer those questions you had anticipated, more puzzles, if you will. That, and I think we've gone long away from the times of positivism, where the idea of disciplines, having specific ways of doing, and the assumption that the best answers to any research questions are those answers that approximate what is verifiable, what is, if you will, the truth. We've gone well beyond that point. And, so it's in the very nature of research work that an invitation to collaborate across, if you will, disciplines, across languages, across genders, across conceptual traditions, if you will, has become important. And in the context from which I'm speaking, which is broadly could be understood to be the African context, research collaboration is actually compelled. I'm not sure that we really do have a choice. And I think my colleague, the first speaker, Mona Hab, was signaling to this very reality that research collaboration is compelled to us by serious historical factors that have shaped how we've come to get to the point where we are at the moment in the endeavor to understand society. And a key part of that dimension is, in the very nature of research involving colonized people, colonized subjects, communities of people that are emerging from a tradition where their own systems of knowledge and inquiry were undermined, almost distorted by an imposing Western tradition of knowing. Those of us who are coming from this particular context have obviously been compelled into research collaboration in order to solve certain very basic challenges that, if you will, have to do with the tensions between, understanding your own society from the perspective from which you have been schooled, and that perspective almost always existing in competition with the other major traditions of knowing, Western in orientation, that, if you will, come with an assumption that they actually are the all-consuming knowers of the colonized subject. And I think this particular entry point is useful for me for the purpose for which this discussion is being conducted, because I am acutely aware that the Arab Council, just like Codesria, are institutions that have been set up partly for the purpose of making sure that colonized peoples can also have a voice in the terrain of knowledge. And so the shift that I think is important for me in the context of research collaboration has been a shift from forms of collaboration that have almost a unilinear north-south direction, where, in the early days, the putative years of independence in Africa, in the 1960s, 1970s, and 1980s in particular, the nature of research collaboration was always a one track from the north to the south. And in the context, say, of Codesria, I think one of the big limitations, the big problems generated by forms of collaboration within the North-South framework was that in the first instance, the assumption that the best forms of knowledge emanate from the North, and that by aligning yourself in collaboration with the North, then you know. So systems of university, systems of university promotion and all that relied on this kind of framework. And the assumption was that, there are leading journals, say in African studies, there are leading journals in Middle East, Eastern studies, and that those journals, give you the best and the best about your own societies. I think that part of the reason why institutions like Codesria do exist has been to begin to really challenge these basic assumptions. But before you even could challenge that assumption, the damage that had been caused to our own societies, our systems of thinking and validating knowledge, were so disastrous. So you have too many African academics across the continent who know so much about what everyone is doing in North America and in Europe, but hardly know the works being done by their colleagues across the boundaries. If you are in South Africa, you know very little about what's happening in Botswana, in Namibia, in Zimbabwe. If you are in Morocco, you know less and less about what's happening in the neighborhood. And I think this particular shift in research collaboration has been instrumental in beginning to open up newer benefits that are important for our own higher education systems, but also for our own ability to form a sense of confidence that the privileging of knowledge coming to us from the North is what we need to have. And I think that the critical point, I think, for the Arab Council, as it is for, say, Clarkson in Latin America or Codesria, has been to begin to identify forms of knowledge within the global South that are useful as rallying points for transformations around policy. Because our communities, in a sense, do mimic each other. The challenges that we face in the higher education sector are almost the same. They relate to funding challenges. Many African countries have to deal with the funding research that is in competition with the whole range of other socioeconomic demands elsewhere. And precisely because of that, it becomes very difficult for us as communities of scholarship in the global South, in Africa, for instance, to be able to mount researchers at a level of sophistication, say, compared to what we get in the global North. And I think by being able to collaborate across the South, we position ourselves not only to be able to expand the knowledge base, but to also insert our voices in global discourses, perhaps in matters, in ways that we wouldn't have been able to. So, for instance, the chair, Omar, speaks about critical security studies, a team that they have been leading. And just listening to some of the reflections that I hear and reading some of the work that you do, there is so much that African academics can learn from the critical security studies team that the Arab Council is supporting, compared to if we were hanging around trying to understand human security, for instance, focusing perhaps on what the UN is doing or how other societies in the global North are framing the security question. There is so much that the Arab Council, through this critical security team, is doing that speaks very directly, both conceptually and methodologically, I would say, to what we do in Africa, than, say, if I was going to be focusing on some of the centers of. And there is a politics of naming that is central to this, that on the basis of research being done in the global South, we are able to remove the pretensions around the politics of naming that have so dangerously framed how we think and the assumptions we bring to what we think. And so for me, I think that away from, this big shift from research collaboration from North-South to South-South is perhaps an axis that we want to develop even more and to be able to push our arguments in directions that are important. Now, Mona did speak extensively about several of the divides that have been. But I think it's also important for the Arab Council for Codesria not to ignore two key divides that have been very difficult for research collaboration. And the first one for me is a gendered divide. A gendered divide that basically helps us, first of all, center the very fact that in everything we do and the societies we study, everything in the lives of our people are gendered. This for me is very important, and I think our communities of research have been a lot more reluctant to push the gender divide in directions that will perhaps make our research a lot more productive. And the second one that I would also like to put on the table, and I hope we can discuss it later on, are divides that touch on generation. Because I think that there is a heavy dose of gerontocracy, if you will, in the research traditions that we have. And I'm not saying this in the negative sense. There is a lot of wisdom and there is a lot of learning that has to take place between generations. But I think that at the end of the day, we do a lot of damage to our own research traditions if we are not nurturing, growing the next generation of researchers. Because what other traditions of research do best has been to be able to nurture the next generation. So many African academics are still fighting in the year 2020 battles that therefore senior scholars already fought in the 1960s, 1970s. And I feel that this is detaining us in a manner that is not productive to our own ability to know our own societies and insert our voices into the communities of scholarship beyond this. And I would like at the end of the day to be able to say that a reflection that pushes these boundaries, of course, there was a disciplinary, there is a divide, there's a class divide. There are conceptual challenges that sit at the heart of the possibilities for collaboration. But if we can bring in more concretely discussions around gendered and generational divides that make our research, accomplishing our research easy, I think that we would have missed an opportunity. So I will stop here, hoping that I can pick up on some of these reflections in the next set of round of response. Thank you very much.
شكرا جزيلا دكتور غادوين مورونغا على مداخلتك القيمة اللي فعلا شرحت لنا أهمية النقل النوعية الذي أقامها كودزريا يعني عبر السنوات في التفكير بطريقة البحث وبالبحث التشاركي، ورغم وجود وبقاء الحواجز المهمة التي قد نعود لها لاحقا بخصوص طبعا النوع الاجتماعي وأيضا الفوارق بين الأجيال. وتطلع يعني أكيد إلى المزيد من النقاشات بين يعني فرق العمل خصوصي بموضوع الدراسات النقدية حول الأمن الذي يعني يحاكي الواقع في المناطق المختلفة. الآن أود أن أدعو الدكتور إنسينغ هو وهو أستاذ الأنثروبولوجيا والتاريخ في جامعة دوك في الولايات المتحدة. لو تفضلت بالجواب على السؤال الأول.
عفوا، تسمعني؟ شكرا على الدعوة الكريمة، وأريد أن أقول Happy Birthday ACSS. أنا متخصص ومتولع في البحث عن العلاقات الاجتماعية والتاريخية بين مناطق عدة. بحثي الأساسي يتناول هجرات الهضارم من جنوب اليمن حول المحيط الهندي، ومن ثم توسع اهتمامي بشكل عام إلى العلاقات التاريخية والثقافية والعائلية والدينية والسياسية إلى آخره ما بين شبه الجزيرة العربية وشرق إفريقيا، الهند وجنوب شرق آسيا. معظم طلابي على مستوى الدكتوراه قاموا بالبحث عن مجتمعات أو جماعات مسلمين متنقلين بين عدة مناطق كذلك. فنتيجة من هذا الإطار الجغرافي الواسع، أهم نوع من التعاون البحثي هو التعاون مع زملاء وأصدقاء الذين يقيمون في هذه المناطق خاصة حول المحيط الهندي. هؤلاء الزملاء والأصدقاء قد يكونون أساتذة في الجامعة، طلاب دراسات عالية، مؤرخين محليين، أو ناس عندهم هواية في البحث. في تجربتي أهم فائدة من التعاون هي فتح الطريق لكل واحد إلى الأشياء الموجودة في أيدي الآخرين. مثلا الشخص الذي يبذل جهود كمؤرخ منطقته يملك معرفة وموارد التي يتعلق بمنطقته، لكن بسبب عدم وجود الفرصة هو أو هي لا تستطيع أن يشوف الارتباطات الثقافية والتاريخية التي تربط منطقته ومنطقة أخرى، رغم وجود هذه الارتباطات. فإذا قمنا بمشروع الذي يشارك فيه باحثين من عدة مناطق متصلة، قد يظهر من خلال التبادل ظواهر مشتركة. في التبادل البحثي طبعا هناك تفرقات اجتماعية بين ناس من بلدان غنية وبلدان فقيرة مثلا، أو بين بلدان لها قدرة أو تمويل في البحث وبين بلدان ضعيفة من هذه الناحية. من ناحية أخرى بلدان فقيرة قد تملك كنوز في موارد وإشكاليات البحث. فالآن بنتقل إلى العرض بالإنجليزي. One of the important things in this collaboration between people, scholars from different regions is at base, I would say, what we often call by the very sanitized term capacity building. But my understanding of capacity building has been shaped by a decade and a half of collaborations between with scholars and institutions from Africa, Arabia, India, Southeast Asia, and the Far East. You might say basically between West Asia and East Asia, West Asia including also East Africa. So let me go through some modalities of collaboration which I have found to be rewarding. In the first place, a lot of my work is with graduate students at my university, and roughly students who work on the Islamic world. The shared geography of the Islamic world, people who know North Africa, the Middle East, parts of South Asia, Southeast Asia, parts of Africa, the shared geography around a table can surprisingly allow people to make conceptual advances very quickly in discussion. This is because you don't always have to start from basics. Because of a lot of overlapping geography, discussion can advance very quickly in terms of issues and concepts. So to give you an example, around the table in graduate school, I would have, for example, a Kuwaiti student who works on how debt ties together traders from India, Arabia, and Africa. And he will be sitting at the same table with a Pakistani student working on Baluchi mercenaries and security personnel, and people who work in logistics also, people from what is now Pakistan who also work in the Gulf and East Africa. At the same table, you would have an Afghan-American student working on Somalis who are businessmen, some involving hijacking ships off the coast of Africa, Arabia, and Southeast Asia. So when you have a number of students like that sitting around the same seminar table, a lot of sparks start to fly and a lot of connections start to be made, and people make progress very quickly. I would say not only in terms of geography, but conceptually as well. The second sorts of platforms which I found useful are workshops and conferences, bringing these students together with others based in India, the Gulf, and Africa. And as I've said, these students are from these regions, and we have workshops and conferences which bring them together with students who are based in institutions in those other countries. Thirdly, I worked a lot with my colleagues in places like Zanzibar, Riyadh, Calicut, Jakarta, Singapore, Beijing. And mounting research projects together, funding for students for field research, bringing them together for conferences and workshops. This creates a mixed master of these kinds of discussions. Now, institutions are important. I have been based in the US, but I have also at the same time on a visiting basis been based in Singapore. And with a base in Singapore, we have been able to provide funding for research and hosting conferences and building archives. The very different geographical base from the US makes for some interesting things in Singapore. It is, in a sense, both first world and third world. So from a Singaporean base, we are able to get different sets of scholars for collaborations, workshops, different from what you would find in the US or Europe. Essentially a broader and more diverse range of students. Visiting researchers from these countries to Singapore, from Arabia, India, and so on, get access to materials they don't necessarily have in their home countries. Even if they come from rich countries like the Gulf, they don't necessarily have access to those research materials. So countries can be rich materially, but poor in terms of scholarship. And based in Singapore allows you to flip some of those things. The bar to access, such as access to visas, is much lower there than in a Western host. Now, apart from institutions, I think networks of institutions are very useful. It is very useful to have a network of them. So I worked with Zanzibar Indian Ocean Research Institute in Tanzania, King Faisal Center for Research and Islamic Studies in Saudi Arabia, the Tarim Center for Research and Publishing in Yemen, in Malabar, only with individuals, Singapore, the National University, Indonesia, University of Indonesia and the National Islamic University, and in China, Peking University. Now, cooperation between these institutions and personal relations with colleagues there allow, at a basic level, students to access multiple countries. So I've said an important aspect of my work and the work of my students is linking multiple countries in the same research project. So for example, students are able to work on, say, both China and Saudi Arabia at the same time, say on a diaspora of Chinese Muslims who ran off from China with the Communist Revolution, and later were able to embark on diplomatic activity between the Middle East and East Asia. We have students who are able to work on historical relations between India and Indonesia, relations between Arabia, India, Southeast Asia, and also trade, debt, and slavery between Africa, Arabia, and India. So these institutions do give access to students who can then work on multiple countries at the same time and the connections between them. And I think this is very important because a lot of people talk about South-South relations, but these are actually dealing with concrete historically existing South-South relations which basically were interrupted by a few hundred years of colonial activity, but today are reasserting itself in terms of these South-South relations. So it's not so much a political or ideological agenda as an agenda of knowledge production and researching actually existing connections from the past that can inform our thinking of the present and future. Now, apart from these networks, there are also mega networks. And I have two in mind. One is the Inter-Asia Network, which of course Satani Shami, who is now leading ACSS, has been the main driving force for. And this Inter-Asian network has basically mounted conferences across, let's say, basically from Dubai to Hong Kong, across this whole, let's call it West Asia, Inter-Asia space. It has also provided funding for students and postdocs to do the sort of trans-regional work I've been talking about, and allowing students and postdocs to do work on multiple regions, which takes more time and more money. And basically, once they are able to do that, what comes out of it is, I think, some of the best scholarship we are seeing in at least Asian studies. Another institute, which does these mega networks, is the Institute for Asian Studies based in Leiden. Now, these mega networks, the secretariats are based in Europe or the US, but they are very innovative because they are inclusive. So I would not put them as part of your usual north, south, east, west divide. There are people who are thinking along certain lines. No matter where they sit, they do a very good job for the kinds of things we want to do. The network of institutions with the center of geography between West and East Asia, I think, provides an automatic bias for mounting questions from outside the usual Western academy and society. So I think for me, this is an important thing, to have a network of networks of institutions with a center of gravity very different from the usual East-West ones. And to me, this is West Asia to East Asia or the Indian Ocean. And basically having this sort of set of networks and mega networks, for me, I think it enables us to create a new generation and new generations of scholars who come from all over the place, whose books and articles drive a new agenda, not South versus North, East versus West, but creating new perspectives which turn out to also be the best scholarship. And one of the challenges of doing this is to generate new concepts for this non-Western center of gravity. I have worked with concepts like mobility, mobile societies, as part of trying to create, to work with this sort of new geography. And in the end, I think if we are successful and we create truly excellent scholarship, we can then have scholars who themselves are mobile, doesn't matter east, west, south, or north, scholars who have currency everywhere because of the excellence of their work. And I will end there. Thank you.
شكرا دكتور إنسينغ إلى مداخلتك التي تؤشر إلى، يعني تلفت انتباهنا إلى أهمية البحث المقارن ما بين المناطق الجغرافية المختلفة، وأيضا يعني تقودني إلى السؤال الثاني، لأنك طرحت موضوع التعاون المؤسساتي، فأود أن أدخل في السؤال الثاني لحلقة نقاش اليوم، وهو سؤال حول الفوارق ما بين الإنتاج المعرفي بين الأفراد وما بين التعاون المؤسساتي. ما هي الفوارق ما بين التشارك البحثي أو الإنتاج المعرفي التشاركي الفردي وما بين التعاون المؤسساتي؟ هل من المهم أن تتعاون المؤسسات، أو هل هنالك مجال أوسع للابتكار عندما يتعاون الأفراد ذو الاتجاهات الفكرية المتقاربة؟ وسنعود بنفس الترتيب ويبدأ مع الدكتورة منى.
شكرا عمر. in all honesty, and I have very little to reflect on that because I don't have much experience working, collaborating with institutions. Our institution, if we consider the Urban Lab an institution, is still very young, and it was born, and then a series of crises and collapses ongoing hit Beirut. So we are still concerned with shielding it, I would say, before we think about how to collaborate with others. Certainly for me, it's very important to collaborate with other institutions. I think as a co-founder and a co-director at the Urban Lab, I was very much looking forward to thinking about research projects that would be comparative, that could bring together urban centers in the MENA region to think together about possible research agendas, from working on regional issues of interest. We had initiated some partnerships with colleagues in Cairo, in Istanbul, and we were thinking about how we could co-write grant proposal together to attract funding that could sustain our work. So the ideas were there, they were not implemented because of the situation. This is something that I'm very keen on pursuing, so hopefully we'll get the chance to do it. But I don't have a direct experience to reflect on the differences. My first take on the question is that I find that the challenges of collaborative research at the institution level are probably much more difficult and much to bridge than at the individual level. I feel that, at the individual level, first, people, individualities, subjectivities, personalities maybe could be mediated through negotiations, and usually you would select people you get along with, or there's at least some base of intersection that would allow collaborations to happen. My experience with collaborations comes more from my activist side. And, as an activist, I witnessed very difficult situations of collaborations, of lack of collaboration, of unwillingness to collaborate because of egos, personalities, disagreements, inabilities of people to talk together and to transcend contention and to find constructive, productive ways of navigating disagreement. So, if there are similarities in the world of activism and in the world of academia, probably there's. From where I come from, urban activists and urban scholars are very much intersecting. Then my answer to your question, Omar, is that I do find more productive collaborations at the individual level, at least in the present situations and constraints we are in. I find that it requires institutions that are solid, that are confident, that are not worried about competition and about who's going to take the funding, who's going to be under the limelight. And these are more my experiences about working together in the context of Beirut and the field of urban critical urban studies and urban scholarship and practice. Maybe I'll stop with that and give more room to Q&A, maybe to jump back on these issues. Thank you.
شكرا دكتورة منى. دكتور جودوين، حضرتك مدير تنفيذي لمؤسسة، فما رأيك بهذا الموضوع بالتعاون المؤسساتي والفوارق بينه وبين التعاون على مستوى الأفراد؟
Thank you again, and really interesting question. And I think that Dr. Mona has shed important light on the differences between individual and institutional collaboration, issues to do with the institutional traditions and how those enable in some cases and disable in some cases the possibilities of collaboration. Things relating to ease of execution of research project, differences in research ethics and traditions and norms, but also the differences in terms of small versus larger scale. I would like to avoid repeating what Dr. Mona has said by inflecting the question just a little bit. And I'm doing that deliberately because it speaks to the manner in which we do our own, we mobilize our own research at CODESRIA. Because I think that at the end of the day, for purposes of research and for purposes of good research, the differences between individual and institutional based collaboration become very minimal if the entry point recognizes the fact that the individual and the institutional approaches actually feed off each other, and therefore at the end of the day will reinforce our own capacities to mount more vigorous, more engrossing, and perhaps even more interesting research outputs compared to if we made an emphasis between individual and institutional research. In CODESRIA, really, the bigger emphasis has been on using the individual as an entry point to get to the institutional. And this is not out of the fact that we have a whole range of choices around how we can either make a choice between, individual or institutional. The higher education scene in Africa, as I believe in the Arab world, has shifted over the last several decades in ways that make the distinctions between individual and institutional rather of less consequence. Institutions in Africa have been a problem to good collaboration. I mean, let's not run away from this. All the way from the days when censorship was heavy, living under dictatorial, authoritarian regimes that were unhappy with their research outputs and tried in many ways to control what researchers said and what they did, whether they could travel outside of their own countries or they could not travel outside their own countries, sending many of the researchers into exile, not because they wished to, but because the research context within their own countries was not very good. And so the council, CODESRIA, structured a system by which we wanted to enable individuals operating within institutions to be able to determine their own research priorities, to determine their own entry points into their research, but also at the same time get them to recognize that as they grew personally and became well-recognized researchers in their own field, that they were also doing something that contributed to the institutions within which they belonged, and that it's really a fine balancing act that we have attempted to do there. And the results of this have been that we've been able to grow a network of researchers within the African continent and in its own diasporas that are having significant conversations, that are generating their own epistemic communities that are vibrant in ways perhaps that would not have been possible if our only entry point was singular, the institution. And so being able to balance these two, I think, is really very, very important. And, repeatedly, the choice between whether to do individual or collaborate, individual or institutional research is determined by the way the higher education is shifting and the capacities of the state, if you will, to be able to fund research. And also to begin to just raise the difficulty. At some point in the 1980s, 1990s, the buzzword in research was networking. And those of us in CODESRIA, of course, would remember the very cheeky way in which the late Tandika Mkandawire, the former executive secretary of CODESRIA, played around with the word networking. Basically making the point that in the context of the demand for networking, especially from donors and all this, that Africans who are doing the working you know, and others from elsewhere were doing the netting. And he was basically making a play around the whole thing of many African academics being used as primary research collectors of data, and their data being channeled through different networks into theoretical and conceptual frameworks that then began to define how we conducted research and how we thought our own societies. And the dangers of netting and working, if you will, are dangers that continue to be with us over the long term. So being able to grow a cohort of researchers who individually can be empowered to determine their research priorities and therefore be able to position themselves as key players in the networks of knowledge production has been a very important entry point into defining the nature of collaboration. And of course, when those researchers get associated with particular institutions, then the differences between the individual and the institutional become less important and reinforce each other, perhaps to lead into forms of knowledge that are useful. At Codesria, we, however, are also pursuing as a council a partnership with other institutions that would make not just our forms of knowledge produced by Codesria into defining the fields of research, but also being able to reinforce, as I said, a South-South collaboration. And so we're looking forward in the next couple of months with the support of the Swedish International Development Agency, for instance, to mount a partnership with the Arab Council that is going to focus on the Sahel. Basically beginning to ask interesting questions around the Sahel in relation to what are the defining features of forms of livelihoods in the Sahel. And contrary to the expectation, if you will, that we are a social science research council, and therefore this research is going to be conducted from a social science perspective, we chose to use the humanities as an entry point and to develop a conversation between different traditions of research around the Sahel, all the way from North Africa into West Africa and beyond. And we've chosen to define the Sahel as a terrain of movement, as a terrain that elicits interesting questions around how people survive adversity, for instance, but using the humanities as the entry point, poetry, performance, and all these other elements that bring and open the eyes of social scientists into realities in society that otherwise would not be easily seen because of the restrictions of our own methodologies and theoretical framework. So, there is benefit in all this, and my own point would be dissolve the boundaries between individual and institutional and see how the two speak to each other in seamless ways. Thank you very much, Omar.
شكرا دكتور جودوين. دكتور إنسينغ، هل لديك أفكار حول هذا الموضوع؟ You're on mute.
نعم، شكرا أستاذ عمر. عندي بعض الأفكار في هذا الموضوع، العلاقات بين مؤسسات وأشخاص. So institutions or individuals, I think what is very important is to have like-minded individuals working in different institutions, collaborating with each other. So yes, individuals, but like-minded individuals working in different institutions, collaborating with each other. So I think this is, to me, a formula that works in my experience. So to take the example of the Inter-Asia network, which Satani Shami has been running, this network allows one to do broad agenda setting. Broad agenda setting basically to promote research, any research which connects at least two places in Asia together. That includes the Middle East and East Africa. And once you have that broad agenda setting and you do it at multiple levels in very concrete ways, you then enable groups of individuals to get together and mount sharper and more specific steps at specific issues or topics. So I think the two can work together. I think the heroic model you gave of individuals working together, making very sharp pushes is a very good one, but they can be enabled by networks of institutions which set a broad agenda, such as Inter-Asia. So this sort of network can do what individual institutions cannot do. And I've been very happy and lucky to be part of this Inter-Asia network, because my experience is that individual institutions can't do it. Let me tell you why very specifically. Individual institutions, especially academic disciplines and departments, have been in practice very scared of trans-regional research. So although everyone has been talking about globalization, when you come down to it, people have built their whole lives and careers as experts in one language, one culture, one country. So in every doctoral committee I've been on, colleagues are afraid when students actually want to work on more than one country, want to work on connections between two or more countries. This is basically double work. And my colleagues have always been afraid the students will go away and never come back because it is too big, it is too large, it is too deep. Now, the Inter-Asia Network brings together scholars who do that double work, who are discouraged from doing that by their individual institutions. And when we bring them together, they discover others doing similar things. They realize how lonely they were, and now they found a peer group. And Inter-Asia has provided funding for such double work research, conferences, workshops, a summer school even for this sort of work, when individual institutions have not been able to do so. So that's about the network of institutions by like-minded scholars. You can also have institutions. Institutions also are gatekeepers, and this is my second point, gatekeepers that provide access to countries for research. And this is very important. Some countries, as we know, are very nervous about letting researchers come in, researchers from abroad come in. Visas are very hard to get. You may have mukhabarat following you around. Now, such institutions in these countries, having them as collaborators is critical. At the same time, their collaboration over time with known legitimate institutions internationally creates opportunities for scholars in those countries to have new opportunities to participate in a wider world of scholarship. I would call this a soft or gentle opening of such countries. And from my experience, there is a lot of passion for such opportunities and very good people who will make very good use of the opportunity. So again, institutions can be very important as gatekeepers. And if we have individuals who are like-minded, who basically are interested in promoting scholarship, then those institutions are very important for the traffic of scholarship in both directions and can provide, I think, a gentle or soft opening, which builds confidence and in the end, I think benefits everybody, including the country itself.
شكرا دكتور، وشكرا لكم جميعا على هذه الأجوبة التي يعني بإمكاننا أن نستمر في نقاش المواضيع اللي طرحتوها لفترة طويلة، إنما أود إشراك الحضور في هذا النقاش. وسأبدأ بطرح تعليقين وصلونا باللغة العربية، ومن ثم زميلي الياس سيطرح أحد الأسئلة التي وصلتنا باللغة الفرنسية. التعليق الأول هو أن الإنتاج المعرفي باللغة العربية ليس مشجعا تماما لاختلاف المدارس الفكرية لدى الباحثين أنفسهم في المنطقة العربية، فنختلف ويصبح كل طرف يريد أن يثبت أن مدرسته الفكرية هي الأصح. ما تعليقكم على هذه النقطة؟ وربما يمكن أن نطرح هذا السؤال خارج المنطقة العربية، يعني هل هناك بعض يعني التشنجات الفكرية أو الاحتكاك يعني أو المشاكل التي يطرحها التعاون بين مدارس فكرية مختلفة إن كان في المنطقة العربية أم خارجها. والتعليق الثاني هو مسألة التفرغ الأكاديمي هي في الواقع الأزمة التي يعاني منها البحث العلمي بغض النظر عن مسألة التطوير. ما آراؤكم في هذا الصدد؟ التفرغ الأكاديمي أو التفرغ للعمل البحثي أو التفرغ الأكاديمي. الياس، ممكن تشاركنا بأحد الأسئلة في اللغة الفرنسية لو سمحت؟
شكرا عمر. يعني لدينا أسئلة كثيرة باللغة الفرنسية، جمهورنا الناطق باللغة الفرنسية أو متابعونا ناشطون. Voilà, سأطرح السؤال باللغة الفرنسية كما وردنا. Donc, on a une question en français adressée à tous nos panélistes. Quels sont les principaux obstacles à la recherche associant des équipes issues de plusieurs pays? Les différences sont-elles liées aux divergences méthodologiques conceptuelles ou bien aux techniques de collecte des données quantitatives et qualitatives? Et quelles sont les solutions développées pour contourner ces obstacles? Voilà, ça c'est la première question en français.
شكرا. سنطرح الأسئلة إلى جميع المتحدثين. إذا أحد أي شخص عنده جواب بحب يساهم. وأنا عندي سؤال آخر حابب مستلهم من مداخلة الدكتور غودوين الذي أشار إلى الفوارق ما بين الأجيال كأحد الحواجز. خطر لي هذا السؤال خصيصا عندما تحدثنا عن التعاون البحثي بين المؤسسات وبين الأفراد. الفكرة النمطية التي توجد عندي وربما تكون فكرة خاطئة ولا أدري أين أضع نفسي في الأجيال السابقة أم الحالية، إنما أن الجيل القديم كان له اهتمام أكبر في البناء المؤسسي، بناء مؤسسات بحثية في دول الجنوب، بناء التي أتت ضمن لنفترض مرحلة دول العالم الثالث أو حركات عدم الانسياز أو التعاون البحثي المبني على بناء مشروع سياسي. بينما الجيل الحالي هو مهتم أكثر في البحث الشخصي، إن كان مواضيع العمل نقدية، إنما بمعنى أنه أعطيني التمويل لأبحاثي وميرسي أورفوار. طبعا أطرح الموضوع بفجاجة يمكن أكثر من اللازم، إنما ما تعليقكم على الفوارق بين الأجيال، وطبعا على أي من الأسئلة التي طرحت من قبل الحضور. دكتورة منى،
بتحب نمشي بالتسلسل اللي كنا فيه؟
ممكن، تفضلي.
لا أنا ما أنا كنت بفضل نخلط أكثر. بعدنا عم فكر بالسؤال. السؤال حول generational possible challenges. I think in our field in urban studies هذا الشيء منه كتير يتطبق عليه. أنا بحس بالعكس الجنريشن الأكبر منه ما عملت مؤسسات. يا ريت كان في مؤسسات. هو فيلد يمكن شوي it's سوري عم خلط لغات، بعتذر من translators. So what I'm trying to say is that in the critical urban studies field, maybe because it's a relatively novel field, especially in the region, in the way it's conceived and practiced. The graduate programs that teach urban studies in Lebanon at least are just 20 years old, not more than that. So we didn't have much institutions that promoted this type of research. And I would say we are now seeing the experimentation with different kinds of institutions that advance urban knowledge. So I'm thinking about your question in relation to fields and disciplines, that maybe it might vary according to fields and discipline. But I'm also thinking about more classical disciplines like sociology, political science, and I think what you raise as an observation is valid for these social science disciplines, probably. A quick maybe answer on the question that Elias read in French. it's the one on obstacles, right? Divergence méthodologique conceptuelle.
Voilà, il s'agit
right?
Voilà, les
Yes.
les différences sont-elles liées aux divergences méthodologiques conceptuelles ou bien aux techniques de collecte des données quantitatives et qualitatives?
Yes, I can see it in the chat. I think this is a very, very good question, very relevant, and it's hard to answer it, I would say, with a definite answer. I think the question in itself contains elements of the answer. I think all these are challenging dimensions that prevent comparative and regional research. I would add to it funding. I think, like Aung San was saying, if one manages to find research partners in different countries that are aligned on that want to produce knowledge collaboratively, then one can bridge the divergences linked to methodology, or to conceptual explorations or data gathering and mixed methodologies. I think these can be worked out if we, building on what Aung San was saying, like the premise would be identifying like-minded researchers elsewhere, and then one can work around that. I think the challenge, at least from where I see it from, becomes funding and interested donors who would fund such initiatives, because there's a lot of cost incurred related to travel, to meet people. Research takes a longer time. You mentioned earlier it's double work because you want to make these bridges and intersections happen. So finding agencies that are interested in enabling and supporting this type of research, for me, is the challenge. I've tried to pitch a lot of research in the urban field to donors around this, and there were always hesitations about this. It's not easy to find someone who is interested in sponsoring a long-term project and investing in the efforts and the time that it would entail to build a partnership, a network, and invest in relationships that will make it possible. Thank you. That's for me.
Thank you very much for the questions. I think allow me to intervene maybe on one or two of those questions, and in one case maybe just a very generalized comment about knowledge production in Arabic. And I think the question also went on to suggest that it might be also a problem in other places. And I think I don't think that the challenge of a competition of schools of thought, especially when this competition is not framed in a productive way, is strictly a challenge of knowledge production in Arabic. I think it's a challenge that cuts across. And, there were days when competition among schools of thought was like the mover of interesting thinking, new traditions of research, but also new traditions of conceptual traditions, if you will. And so I think I suspect the question around knowledge production in Arabic is centering on a very specific thing that I might not be aware of. In the old Kuhnian sense, paradigm shift, competition between different schools of thought was perhaps the best way by which older traditions of knowledge production were replaced by newer traditions, and innovation and creativity within different disciplines, but also in an interdisciplinary sense, developed. And so what perhaps is important here is to ask the questions: what is it in the competition that is limiting, that we need to deal with, maybe at the ethical, maybe at the methodological level? But I am one of those people who would really be interested in seeing different schools of thought engaging each other and raising significant questions about how we perceive societies that we study, and maybe possibly new traditions of research emanating from that. The question about intergenerational thing, I think the observation about the older generation being interested in institution building and the newer tradition being more in individual research is one that is a fine observation emanating from the shifts in the higher education scene across the world. Institutions like Codesria were the product of a generation of researchers that were interested in building bridges between different nationalities, between different regions, between the disciplines, and the idea that growing institutions that would provide alternative ways of thinking about the African reality, and that tradition, new different ways of thinking about this reality being Pan-African in orientation, is one that I think has been a useful product from the older generation. Again, just to mention Thandika Mkandawire, and maybe we could share his really pithy analysis of what he called 3 generations of African intellectuals, which was a real interesting but brief analysis of how different traditions of African academics have, what were the priorities, what agenda did they set, and how productive have been the debates that have emanated, what challenges have they faced in the context of this. And I can see one of my colleagues, Shaim Mangola, online, picking up that particular study and asking the question around nurturing the next generation of African academics. And one of the things that emanates from there really is the very fact of generations is real. We can't run away from, and each one of them is socialized in particular ways of doing things. But the very need for a conversation between generations, I think, is something that to emphasize. I know this to be true of the Arab world as it is true of the African context. Many of us have gone through situations where traditions of research have framed whether we are going to be inward looking, with narrow nationalism defining the kind of research we undertake, or whether we are opening up to the rest of the world and having, not just intergenerational conversations, but being accepting of a newer, frameworks, gendered frameworks, feminism, for instance, beginning to appreciate the diversities of society and how these diversities are useful for our understanding of things. I think that a fine sociological study of the generational question would be an interesting way to begin to do this. In Codesria, we're spending more time looking at, trying to support academics who are just getting out of their graduate work, postdoctoral students, and trying to support them to develop their capacities, and being able, therefore, to have these intergenerational conversations, I think, would be a very useful thing for us to do. Thank you.
I'd like to address the question of nurturing collaborative research in the Arabic-speaking regions. I'm actually agnostic over which is better, collaborative or individual. I think each has pluses and minuses. Let me just venture some comments on this question. I think different regions have different traditions of research, and a lot of it depends on 2 things. Number one, the rewards system. Are researchers rewarded with jobs, fellowships, money as individuals or in teams? And does the funding system fund individuals or research teams? So in the US, for example, if you look at the spectrum from collaborative to individuals, it depends on the type of field. In science, and especially in technology, work is very collaborative. Every paper has 5, 10, 15 authors, completely collaborative. In the US, in the social science, you have a range. Fields like sociology can be very collaborative. And in the humanities, it is mostly individualistic. And some fields like anthropology and history, which are sometimes social science, sometimes humanities, tend to be more individualistic also. So within the United States, there is a range going from technology and science through social science to humanities, very collaborative to individual. And in terms of the reward system, there are ways of rewarding people in teams. So for example, the person who is taking the lead on a specific topic or issue is a lead or first author in the publication, and the person who runs the lab is the last name. So there is a way of rewarding, recognizing individuals as well. And of course, in the sciences, the research funding can be in the millions, tens of millions, or even hundreds of $1 million. In the humanities, individuals is much less. Now in Europe, it is different. In Europe, you have more of a collaborative bias. You have in science, mega size collaborative projects funded at big, huge levels, larger than individual teams in the US. And in Europe also, you have a lot of collaborative funding for social sciences, such as in the Max Planck Institutes. And the Europeans have done this to essentially outcompete the Americans. In the humanities, you have much more individual work in Europe. So it is different in different regions. What is appropriate, what is useful for the Arabic-speaking regions? I don't really know. It will have to do with the reward system, the funding system, and basically the nature of institutions in the region. Thank you.
Thank you. Une autre question en français, on a beaucoup de questions en français en fait. Quelles sont les implications de la recherche collaborative au regard de la diversité des sensibilités analytiques et des enjeux au niveau des rapports sociaux de pouvoir? Dr. Mona?
Yes, I guess it's coming back to me.
Voilà. Yeah.
Yes, I read these questions. I think we answered them partially in indirect ways. When we talked about individual research, I'm not sure what the person who asked the question means in relation to social relations of power. I would skip that one. Sorry, it's not very clear to me how to answer that.
Dr. Goodwin, do you have something to add regarding this question?
Can you repeat the question for
Of
me,
course,
please?
I will. Sure. Donc, quelles sont les implications de la recherche collaborative au regard de la diversité des sensibilités analytiques et des enjeux au niveau des rapports sociaux de pouvoir?
So I think there is a sense in which I mean, let me first acknowledge this a rather complex question, because you have to disaggregate some of the points that are actually being embedded in it. And one of the points to disaggregate is the power relations. I really cannot figure out what power relations you're talking about, whether those power relations are embedded, within the collaborating team, among individuals, or whether it's about, different teams, that are working around collaborative research and different forms of power being manifested in them. So I'm not too clear about that. But one of the things that obviously has been there is that depending on what kind of a collaborative team is together, there will be obviously serious power dynamics involved. And we've been in research teams where if, say, the collaboration is between individuals in northern universities, universities based in the global north and universities based in the global south, the nature of the power relations is totally different from, say, if the individuals involved in collaboration are within, say, the Arab world or between the African teams. But also even in the global side, there are power dynamics that manifest depending on the countries where people are coming from, depending on the institutions where people are coming from, and what that means for the overall research. There are some also disciplinary orientations that are useful in determining the dynamics of power, involved in any research work, with different emphasis, some going a lot more theoretical around particular things, and others going a lot more empirical, around particular things, and that at the end of the day generates, specific tensions. Some of them very productive for research, some of them not too productive for research. So I think there is, I guess the point, the reason why we're finding it difficult to respond to that question is that the range of possibilities around what power dynamics mean here and where they are emanating is what we are not too clear about. And if there can be perhaps a clarification on that, then we can speak very directly to particular concrete situations. I know for sure that there have been situations where, to admit, much of the research funding is coming from the global north. Many of our institutions are actually being funded from, donors who are located in Europe, in the US and all that. And what that means for the nature of collaboration and also for the power dynamics involved in that is completely different, say, if we were just mobilizing our own resources and being able to run researches. Who defines the terms of engagement? How, who conducts the actual research in field, and all that are things that then become useful in terms of the discussion around power dynamics. I feel like that question hasn't been answered very well, but there are too many variables missing from the question for me to be able to reflect upon it more accurately.
تمام، شكرا. دكتور إنجزينغ، هل لديك ما تضيفه في هذا الصدد أو ننتقل إلى سؤال آخر؟ تفضل.
نعم. عندي ملاحظة. So what are the implications of collaborative research at the level of social power relations is the question I got. Now, collaborative research, understood as many people working on one project, I think is only as good as the driving questions that conceptualize the project. Questions which are broad, wide ramification, but can also crystallize an issue sharply and generate subsidiary questions that point researchers to many fields of empirical data gathering. So collaborative research driven by these types of questions can be very valuable. Without good driving questions, collaborative research can be basically a waste of money and time. And if you have countries which want to start to do collaborative research and throw a lot of money at it, but have not built up good, high quality research capacity, then in itself, there is no intrinsic value to collaboration, and countries which do this throw a lot of money at collaboration without people who can formulate good questions, simply create fiefdoms or mansabs for individuals to create power bases. And I think you see a fair bit of that as well.
شكرا. نختم هذه الجولة النقاشية بسؤال من فيسبوك فقط كي لا نتجاهل متابعينا ومتابعاتنا على فيسبوك. لدينا سؤال موجه إلى دكتور غودوين. يطرح أحد المتابعين على فيسبوك: كيف يمكن أن نتحدث عن عمل تشاركي أو بحث تشاركي فيما يغيب التمويل والدعم المالي تحديداً في الدول الفقيرة؟
Trust me, the dilemma of research funding is one that detains my attention, all through. And actually it is a dilemma. It is a dilemma partly because there are various dynamics in research funding that eternally should worry all of us. The inability or the refusal of our own governments in Africa. I believe even in the Arab world, this is a challenge that manifests to prioritize research, you know, as an important aspect of what they need to resource. That's one level of challenge. There is also the challenge that even when you're producing good results and you can demonstrate the value of the research you are doing to the communities, national or local, that you belong to. There is also the dilemma that your own local governments, your own local institutions would be more interested in finding policy advice from external sources rather than from your own research. Again, that's another dilemma. But there is also the dilemma of he who pays the piper, you know, calls the tune. And again, this has remained a key challenge. I think, though, that the question might be making a rather wrong assumption if we say that we have to wait for enough research funding to be available for us to be able to conduct collaborative participatory research. I think that would be a very wrong assumption. I think that in the context within which we are operating at the moment, and even with limited funding of the research that we do, there is enough reason for us to find suitable ways of being able to conduct, you know, collaborative participatory research that begins to really just, if for nothing else, to enlighten us about our own societies and the big shifts that are happening in society that we cannot avoid. Ignorance about our own society, just because the funding was not adequate enough for us to be able to, you know, enlighten ourselves and enlighten our communities, would be a rather deadly cost, actually a disaster of sorts that we would be getting into if we do not find suitable ways of doing this. So in the context in which we operate, if it means negotiating our autonomy in raising our own research questions, in mounting the kinds of research we need to do, just negotiating our autonomy, but getting the funding from whichever sources that we deem necessary is a solution that is imposed on us. We may not like it. We may not like the fact that our own governments, our own institutions aren't funding us. In Africa, there is an even bigger dilemma that many of the philanthropic institutions that would provide research funding for African researchers, for instance, really prefer to fund institutions in the global north. We've been in situations where you do effective work for individuals who are able to fund research who are African, who have made big money. They end up sending these research funds to, you know, Harvard School of Oriental and African Studies and all these places. You know, we rank low in terms of even being priorities as research institutions to our own, you know, people who have made the money. So these dilemmas are there. But I just want to conclude by saying that we do not have the luxury of remaining ignorant about our own societies because the funding was limited or it was less. I think that would be a dangerous thing for us to do.
شكرا، أشكرك دكتور غادون. أعتقد أن هذه النصائح القيمة هي يعني محطة مناسبة لإنهاء النقاش ويعني للتفكير بهذا الموضوع يعني فعلا مهم. ففي النهاية أود شكر المتحدثين زملائي الدكتورة منى، الدكتور إنسينغ، الدكتور غادون على هذه المداخلات القيمة التي فعلا يعني ممكن الاستمرار بالنقاش بها مطولا، وأرجو أن يكون هناك يعني جلسات لاحقة للتفكير في هذه المواضيع الهامة لنا جميعا. فأشكركم جميعا، أشكر الحضور والمترجمات والمترجمين الذين فعلا يعني صبروا معنا اليوم على اللغات المتعددة، فشكرا لكم. وأدع الكلمة الأخيرة لزميلي الياس للختام.
شكرا. بدوري أيضا أنا أتوجه بشكر جم للمتحدثين والمتحدثات. لك عمر شكرا على التيسير وعلى حسنه، لجميع من انضم إلينا عبر زوم وطبعا عبر فيسبوك. وكنت أشرت مشكورا الشكر الموصول للمترجمات الأربع اليوم اللواتي رافقننا في هذه الحلقة. هذه الحلقة سيعاد بثها على صفحة المجلس في فيسبوك، كما سترفع إلى قناتنا في يوتيوب Arab Council for the Social Sciences لمن يرغب في طبيعة الحال في إعادة مشاهدتها. أما الحلقات المقبلة فيمكن الاطلاع عليها من خلال الرزنامة التي ننشر رابطها الآن في خانة الدردشة شات عبر زوم، وفي تعليق كومنتير على هذا الفيديو في فيسبوك. طبعا يمكنكم الاطلاع على الحلقات الخمس المتبقية في سلسلة الحلقات العشر. موعدنا يتجدد في حلقة النقاش السادسة في 10 من تموز يوليو المقبل. تفاصيل هذه الحلقة ننشرها قريبا على منصاتنا الاجتماعية فيسبوك وتويتر وعلى موقعنا الإلكتروني acss.org. واكبونا لمزيد من المعلومات والتفاصيل. إلى حينها شكرا مجددا وإلى الملتقى.
شكرا جزيلا. إلى اللقاء. باي باي.
شكرا.
إلى اللقاء. باي باي.